Flint Dibble is a trained archaeologist and academic who has become a prominent public voice in debates between archaeology and what is often labeled pseudoscience. He is known for emphasizing methodological rigor, stratigraphy, material evidence, and peer-reviewed standards, and for publicly challenging speculative claims that lack archaeological support. In many respects, this approach is correct. Archaeology should challenge unfounded speculation, selective use of evidence, and narratives built without methodological discipline. On numerous subjects, Flint Dibble is right to demand higher standards of proof and to criticize sensationalism. I appreciate and openly acknowledge this effort to push back against pseudoscience. However, it is precisely because of this role that the subject of Atlantis deserves closer scrutiny. When it comes to Atlantis, Flint Dibble represents a widely held modern position. That Atlantis was never a real place, but a fictional or allegorical invention by Plato intended to convey moral, political, or philosophical ideas rather than historical events. This conclusion is often presented as settled fact, supported by what is called scholarly consensus. But a consensus is not evidence. It is an agreement among scholars, not a demonstration based on primary sources. What is rarely addressed, and what this video focuses on, is a much simpler and more fundamental question. Where exactly does Plato say that the story of Atlantis is fictional or allegorical? Not where modern scholars think he implies it, not what later interpretations suggest, but where Plato himself explicitly or implicitly states this in his own text. To date, no one, including Flint Dibble, has produced a direct quotation from Plato in which Atlantis is described as a myth, an allegory, or an invention. And that matters. Plato was fully capable of using allegory when he wished to do so. The allegory of the cave is one of the most famous examples in all of philosophy, explicitly framed as an analogy and a symbolic illustration of human perception and knowledge. But Plato also knew how to distinguish between myth and historical account. Throughout his works, he carefully differentiates mythos from logos. When he presents myths, he signals them clearly. In the case of Atlantis, however, Plato does something very different. He repeatedly insists that this is a true account, preserved through historical transmission passed from Egyptian priests to Solon and from Solon to Critias. At this point, an important clarification is necessary. Archaeologists are not the authorities when it comes to deciding the authenticity of the story itself. They cannot state with certainty whether Atlantis ever existed or not, because archaeology does not work that way. Archaeology can only evaluate material remains that have survived and have been discovered. What archaeologists can do, legitimately and rigorously, is something far more limited, but also far more decisive. They can determine whether a civilization matching Plato's description could have existed at a specific period, particularly around the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000 years ago. And this must be stated clearly. Archaeology is the only discipline that can say with certainty that no Atlantis, as described by Plato, could have existed during that period. If the archaeological record conclusively demonstrates that a civilization of that scale, organization, and complexity was impossible at that time, then Atlantis can be ruled out. No one else has that authority. Not me, not Graham Hancock, not any independent researcher or commentator. Until archaeology itself can definitively demonstrate that such a civilization could not have existed, the question remains open, not proven, but not dismissed either. The question of whether the story itself is true does not begin with archaeology. It begins with philology. The first authorities are philologists, those who can read Plato in ancient Greek, analyze his language, structure, and intent, and determine whether the narrative presents itself as myth, allegory, or historical account. Only after the text is properly understood can geologists and geophysicists contribute by translating Plato's geographical and geological descriptions into real-world processes such as erosion, earthquakes, flooding, and coastal subsidence. This brings us to a concrete example often used to dismiss Plato's credibility. Flint Dibble frequently states that the Atlantis story must be fictional for one central reason: that Plato allegedly made an obvious factual error regarding Athenian topography specifically, that he believed the Acropolis was physically connected to Mount Lycabettus. From this alleged mistake, the broader conclusion is drawn that Plato's account cannot be historical and must therefore be fictional. But Plato never said that. In Critias, Plato explains that in remote antiquity, the Acropolis extended toward the Eridanus and the Ilissus, not toward Lycabettus, and that Lycabettus functioned explicitly as a boundary, not as a connected landmass. At no point does Plato claim that the Acropolis and Lycabettus were physically connected. Notably, Flint Dibble does not cite any peer-reviewed geological study to support this claim. On the contrary, peer-reviewed research by the renowned Greek geophysicist Stavros Papamarinopoulos, particularly his work published in the Bulletin of the Geological Society of Greece, addresses the geoarchaeology of the Acropolis and directly contradicts the assertion that Plato's description is geologically impossible. Therefore, the argument that Plato made a demonstrably false geographical statement collapses. The error lies not in Plato's description, but in a modern misinterpretation of it. Plato also explains why modern Athens does not resemble his description through catastrophic erosion, earthquakes, and flooding long before his own time. At this point, another methodological issue must be addressed, one that archaeologists rarely confront directly: internal chronological contradictions in the transmitted account and what those contradictions actually imply. In Timaeus, Plato reports that the Egyptian priest Sonchis of Sais told Solon that the city of Sais, his own hometown, and the location where the narrative is preserved, was founded by Athenians 1,000 years after the war with Atlantis. This places the founding of Sais around 8,600 BC, while the Atlantean conflict is placed at 9,600 BC. Yet the same priest is said to have told Solon that the Atlanteans conquered that region during the war. This creates an obvious contradiction. How could the Atlanteans conquer Sais 1,000 years before it existed as a city? A second contradiction deepens the problem. Plato states that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon, placing the catastrophe around 9,600 BC. Sonchis adds that, in Plato's time, the sea where Atlantis once lay was shallow and muddy, preventing ships from passing because the remains of the city lay just below sea level. But according to modern oceanography, global sea levels have risen by approximately 100 meters since the end of the last ice age. If Atlantis had been destroyed in 9,600 BC and sea levels have risen by that magnitude since then, the remains of the city should now lie far deeper than just below sea level, not shallow enough to obstruct navigation. Neither Flint Dibble nor other mainstream archaeologists seriously engage with these contradictions. They are usually ignored or treated as proof of fiction. But these contradictions do not demonstrate that the story is false. They indicate that something is wrong with the numbers, with the way Egyptian chronology was translated, transmitted, or interpreted into Greek. If Sonchis had literally told Solon that these events occurred 9,000 years earlier, Solon would have immediately recognized the problem. Solon was not a naive listener. He was one of the 7 sages of the Greek world, a lawgiver and intellectual of the highest standing. It is far more plausible that the original Egyptian account used different numerical units, cycles, or symbolic measures that were later misunderstood as literal years. I have read the works of Plato throughout my life, and in particular Timaeus and Critias in their original language. That task alone is challenging, because no one is truly fluent in ancient Greek in the modern sense. The language demands interpretation, comparison, and constant philological caution. Nevertheless, sustained engagement with the original text reveals fundamental translation and interpretive errors. Errors significant enough to influence the prevailing consensus within mainstream archaeology. Although Flint Dibble is right to challenge pseudoscience, in this specific case, he has arguably fallen victim to it in another form by repeating unexamined assumptions about Plato's text and building sweeping conclusions without returning fully to the primary source. This is not an accusation of bad faith. It is a reminder that even rigorous scholars can misstep when disciplinary boundaries are crossed. Finally, it must be stated clearly, this position is not an endorsement of Graham Hancock's theories, nor an adoption of speculative alternative archaeology. I do not argue for lost global civilizations or advanced prehistoric technologies. This discussion is about Plato, his text, and how it has been read. Rejecting speculative archaeology does not justify dismissing a primary text by attributing to it claims it never makes. This video is not an attack on archaeology, nor on Flint Dibble as a person. It is a critique of a methodological leap. The leap from "we have no archaeological proof" to "Plato invented the story." Those are not the same claim. I therefore extend a friendly and open invitation to Flint Dibble for a public, respectful debate, focused not on personalities, but on evidence, texts, and method. A discussion grounded in philology, geology, and archaeology can only strengthen our understanding, whatever conclusions it ultimately leads us to. To understand Atlantis, we must return to the only primary source that describes it, Plato himself, read carefully in context and in his original language.